Giant Causeway on the coast of Northern Ireland is one of the UK's outstanding natural features. Its steep cliffs and deep bays form a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Tourists and National Trust rangers saw the legendary fin disappear into a magical doorway within the rock face here at the Giant's Causeway.
At the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, witnesses watched a slab of solid basalt swing open like a door, then seal itself shut again, leaving no crack, no seam, no proof it had ever moved. For years, that ancient stone door stayed closed, something no one could explain and no one dared open. Then it was finally open. A single camera slipped through the wall beside it into the sealed dark behind it, and what came back out was never meant to be seen.
It was 100 meters deep. It was 1200 degrees Celsius, and it's like everything. If you boil a kettle, it'll cool down. The pool of lava had to cool down.
The people who have seen it cannot unsee it. It is the one reason that door should have stayed shut. The clips nobody kept. Let me back up, because to understand why a careful man drove to a coastline alone and told no one, you have to know what reached him first. It started with scattered clips. Short, shaky, low resolution, the kind passed hand to hand between researchers and quiet enthusiasts who could not agree on whether they were watching a hoax or something far worse. Tourists and National Trust rangers at the Giant's Causeway described watching a section of the rock face open. Not crack, not crumble, open the way a door opens and then close again behind whatever had passed through. The location alone makes people lean in. Here, around 60 million years ago, we had lots of volcanoes. Up from those volcanoes flowed lava, and it covered the entire area. This is the coastline tied for centuries to Finn McCool, one of the great figures of Irish legend. The giant said to have built those columns himself during a feud with a rival across the sea in Scotland. So when word spread that a doorway had been seen opening in that exact rock face, the story practically wrote itself. A doorway at the causeway where the legends already live. Almost everyone who saw the clips dismissed them within minutes. And honestly, you would have too. Basalt does not open. It fractures, collapses. It weathers down over thousands of years into the famous interlocking columns that pull 1 million visitors a year to that coast. So the clips got waved away. A hoax, a trick of editing. The kind of thing that earns 10,000 views in a weekend and then vanishes into the noise forever. But one man did not wave it away. And the reason he could not is the same reason you are still here. His name was Kieran Orla, and he was the last person you would expect to chase a story like this. He had spent years as a field archaeologist running subsurface surveys and structural analysis across Ireland before he walked away from the profession entirely. Methodical data first. The kind of man who believed you measure the rock. You record what it tells you, and only then do you let yourself wonder what it means. No fringe theories, no speculation he could not defend in front of people who wanted him to be wrong. He measured twice and published nothing he could not stand behind. And when he watched that footage, he did not see a hoax. He saw something that made a cautious man stop being cautious. Because here is the thing about Orla. Everyone else who watched those clips was watching the movement, the drama of it, the impossible sight of stone swinging on a hidden hinge. Orla was not watching the movement at all. He was watching the edge, the exact line where the rock had separated from the rest of the rock. And to understand why that one detail unraveled him, you have to understand how basalt is actually born. Basalt forms when lava cools fast. That fast cooling is exactly what built the famous columns at the causeway. Those tight geometric pillars packed shoulder to shoulder like something a mason laid by hand. But the geometry comes from stress. As the lava cools, it contracts. And as it contracts, it tears itself apart along fracture lines. Picture wet mud on a hot day. As it dries, it shrinks. And as it shrinks, it cracks into rough, uneven polygons. Basalt does the same thing, only in stone. Only over a span of time that dwarfs anything human. And here is what matters. The single fact that broke him. Those fractures are messy. At the microscopic level, they are always messy, even when they look clean from a few feet away. So when a piece of basalt moves, any piece for any reason, it has to leave a trail. Crushed dust, micro fractures spidering out along the break. A seam where two stone faces ground against each other and left their record in powder and scarring. Something. There is always something. In that footage, there was nothing. No crumbling, no falling debris, no distortion rippling through the surrounding stone. Just a controlled shift and then stillness. As though the rock had been built to do exactly that one thing and nothing else. Orla went back through the clips frame by frame, hunting for the trick. A compression artifact, a clever cut, a shadow doing the work the rock could not. He did not find it, and the longer he looked, the worse it got, because careful looking is supposed to expose the lie. Here it only exposed how few lies there were to find. That is the moment a man who had never once chased a fringe theory in his life decided to drive to a coastline alone. So what does a careful man do when the careful answer runs runs out. He goes looking for a way in, and he does not go looking where you would expect, hunting the weak point. His equipment was not unusual for subsurface work. What was unusual was how he meant to use it. At the center of it was a rotary hammer drill, professional grade, the kind built for heavy masonry and reinforced stone, fitted with a 40mm carbide-tipped masonry bit extended through a series of couplings so it could reach real depth without widening the entry hole. That last part mattered to him more than anything. A narrow bore meant minimal surface disturbance and less risk of bringing the cliff down around his own head. But the drill was never the important part. The location was. And here is where Orla did the thing that tells you he was serious and not just curious. He did not try to breach the visible face of the cliff where the movement had happened. That is the obvious move, and it would have been close to suicidal. Basalt that thick resists direct drilling for hours, maybe days, and forcing through it risked collapsing everything around you. The door itself was the strongest, most stubborn part of the whole formation. So he did not look for the door. He looked for weakness, because basalt does not cool as one clean uniform block. That uneven contraction leaves variations in density, pockets of internal stress, layers that differ from one section to the next. You cannot see any of that from the surface. But a man trained to read grain orientation, fracture alignment, and the direction the ancient thermal flow once moved, that man can infer it. So that is what Orla did for hours with his bare hands. Cracks in the Earth's crust. Lava starts to pour out. It allows it to form into very regular shapes. No scanners, no ground-penetrating radar, just touch and measurement. And the way the surface caught the low light, he traced faint shifts in texture and color across the rock face, narrowing it down, hunting for a spot where the stone would be thinner, or at least less willing to fight him for every inch. And the point he finally chose was not against the stone door itself. It was close to it, close enough that if anything ran behind that section of cliff, his bore might punch straight into it. Close enough that he was in a very real sense knocking on the wall right beside a door that had opened on its own. If you are already leaning in, do me one quick favor before this goes where it is about to go. Hit that subscribe button. A huge number of people watching this right now have not. And these are exactly the kinds of stories that get buried the moment a channel like this one stops surfacing them. It is free, takes 1 second, and it makes sure the next door we open finds its way to you too. That is all. Now back to the cliff, because Orla has just set the drill against the weak point. And what happens next happens faster than he can react. When resistance vanished, the first layer behaved exactly as it should. Dense, unyielding. The resistance pushed back through the tool with a steady, predictable force, and the vibration was textbook solid volcanic rock. No cavities, no fractures, nothing strange. The dust coming out of the borehole was the fine, dark particulate you would expect from basalt under stress, and the sound was the flat, grinding monotone of a bit doing honest work against honest stone. He worked it slow, holding pressure, adjusting the angle by fractions, easing off whenever the heat climbed too high in the bit. Minutes passed, then more minutes. The hole crept deeper, and nothing about it suggested he was drilling toward anything but more of the same. Nothing changed until it did, and it did not change gradually. There was no warning, no softening of the stone, no shift in the pitch of the cut to tell him he was nearing the far side of something. One moment the bit was grinding through solid rock. The next moment it was grinding through nothing at all. The resistance dropped instantly and completely. The force he had been bracing his entire body against simply vanished, and the drill lurched forward several inches before he could catch it. The feedback through the tool went from a dense, heavy grind to something hollow, empty, open. He killed the power and froze with the bit exactly where it was, half buried in the rock, the other half hanging in a space that should not exist. For a long moment he did not move at all. He just stood there with both hands still locked around a tool that had stopped fighting him, listening to his own breathing and the wind coming off the water behind him, aware in a way that had nothing to do with training that the rock had just told him something true. And in that silence, before he had widened the hole enough to look, before he had seen a single thing, a careful man already understood what he had done. The only questions left were whether he would be able to look at it and whether he should. What the silence told. He did not widen the hole. Not yet. First he listened. And this is the part one think about the most. No air moved through the opening. He held the back of his hand to it and felt nothing. Not the faintest draw or push of pressure equalizing. He leaned in close and there was no echo, no breath of sound returning from the other side. Nothing stirred. Here is why that should bother you the way it bothered him. A natural cavity in coastal basalt is almost never truly sealed. Water finds its way in. Air moves through it. The sea, given enough time, works into every weakness it can reach and never stops. A space that had stayed closed enough that not one breath of air moved when he punched through it, is a space that something kept closed, which meant whatever was inside had not seeped in over the slow centuries. It had either always been there or it had been put there. Only then did he begin to widen the entry point carefully, just enough to feed a machine through, because whatever waited on the other side of that wall, Kieran Orla had already decided one thing without quite admitting it to himself. He was not going in after it. Sending in the crawler, he fed a small small tracked crawler through the opening. A camera on treads low to the ground, its own lights mounted to the front. He let it settle on the far side, let the lens stabilize, and then he sent it forward into the dark, the same way you would lower something into deep water when you have no idea what is waiting at the bottom. He had thought about a lot of things in the hours it took to find that weak point. He had not let himself think about this one, about the moment he would actually commit a machine to the dark and lose the ability to call it back by hand. Once those treads carried it past the opening, the only thing connecting him to whatever was in there was a thin, flickering signal and his own nerve. He checked the feed twice. He checked it a third time. Then he stopped stalling and let it go. I have to be honest with you about why this part becomes difficult to relay in full. What the camera recorded is not something that can be shown completely here. Not because the footage is unclear, but because of what appears in the frame and what refuses to hold still long enough to be seen properly. The fuller version with the frame-by-frame breakdown sits in the archive linked in the pinned comment and below. What you are getting here has already been pared back. I will take you exactly as far as the description allows and not one step further. The first stretch was almost ordinary. Rough basalt, the kind you would expect just inside any cavity in that cliff. But the floor under the crawler was wrong in a quiet way. It was level, unnaturally level, compared to the broken jumble of rock back at the entry point. Smooth, even as though something had once flattened it on purpose and then left. And keep the door in your mind as the crawler moves, because everything the camera is about to find sits behind it. The crawler's lights found the first of the shapes, and ordinary was over. The suspended forms. They were hanging, suspended from somewhere above in a loose cluster, dull surface, drinking the light from the crawler's lamps instead of throwing any of it back. The footage will not let them be seen cleanly, and that is the problem. They do not hold still enough. There is a subtle inconsistency to them, a barely perceptible shift from one frame to the next, as if their position is not entirely fixed, even though nothing in that dead sealed space should be moving them at all. Stop and sit with that for a second the way Aura did. Something was hanging in a chamber no air could reach, and it would not stay still. The floor beneath the forms was darker than the surrounding stone. Stained, uneven, shallow pools of liquid were scattered across it, breaking the crawler's light into fractured reflections that never quite resolved into anything he could name. He eased the unit forward beneath the last of the hanging shapes, and for a brief moment, the ceiling cleared and the light spread evenly again. Visibility improved, but only for a few meters. He kept the crawler moving, slow, deliberate. The way you would move through a room you suspected was not empty. And every few seconds, the lens would catch another one of the forms at the edge of the frame. And every single time, it sat slightly differently than the past before. Not swinging, not falling, just not where it had been. A man who had spent an entire career insisting that stone behaves predictably was now watching things that did not behave at all in a place that should have been as dead as the inside of a tomb. He ran the unit back just a meter just to catch the cluster from a second angle, hoping the new line of sight would flatten them into something ordinary. A nod of mineral growth, a trick of the lamp, it did the opposite. From the side, they were no more readable than they had been hidden, and the faint shifting only got harder to dismiss because now he could see it against a fixed edge of rock and measure it against something that was not moving at all. And then the air itself turned against the camera. The air turned. It did not announce itself as a wall or a boundary. It revealed itself through interference, the way the worst things always do. Not with a bang, but with the picture slowly getting harder to trust. The light from the crawler's lamp began scattering harder, diffusing outward into a faint haze. Edges softened. Contrast dropped away. Depth became almost impossible to judge. There was moisture suspended in that air, not heavy enough to fall as droplets, not yet, but dense enough to fog the camera's sense of distance until the dark ahead felt closer and farther away at the same time, and the floor changed with it. The unnatural flatness gave way to subtle irregularities. The surface darkened in patches, drinking in more light than the stone around it. The crawler's tracks began leaving faint impressions behind them, compressing a thin layer of something that was not rock and was not quite water either. The shallow pooling spread into the low spots, thin, uneven, throwing the light back in broken patterns that never once formed a clean mirror image. They rippled, and here is the detail that should put a cold finger on the back of your neck. Even when the crawler sat completely still, the reflections moved, which meant one of two things. Either the liquid was not still or the surface underneath it was not stable, or slowed the crawler and dipped the camera toward the ground. There was no flow direction to the liquid, no source feeding it from anywhere. It simply gathered in the shallow depressions and stayed, held by the shape of the floor. Its color was hard to pin down, almost black under direct light. But when the angle shifted, faint variations surfaced, tones that pulled away just slightly from the basalt around them, enough to suggest it was not simply water sitting on stone. The crawler moved again, and the tracks did not grip the way they had. A slight delay between command and response, a subtle slip as the unit dragged itself forward through the dampened ground. And then the camera tilted up and Orla saw the ceiling. Lines in the ceiling. First, it was easy easy to miss. The light caught something overhead that did not match the texture around it. Something linear, something cutting straight across the natural flow of the rock where nothing straight had any right to be. The camera tilted further up and the pattern resolved. There were structures embedded in the ceiling, not hanging from it like the suspended forms, not protruding out of it, integrated into it, running horizontally across the space, intersecting the rock at regular intervals. They looked like beams, partly obscured by the surrounding material, but distinct enough to break the natural continuity of the basalt completely. And here is the part Orla's training would not let him explain away. Remember the rules I told you about, the ones that govern every piece of volcanic rock on that coast. Cools, it contracts, it cracks along predictable lines, and every bit of its internal structure follows from the physics of how it formed. Nothing in those rules produces evenly spaced horizontal members that hold a straight line through curving stone. You can find geometry in basalt. Yes, the columns themselves are proof of that, but it is the geometry of stress and cooling, the geometry of an accident repeated at scale. It is never the geometry of intent. What the camera was showing him had the second kind. The spacing was consistent, measured, each beam positioned at intervals that mirrored the pattern of the suspended forms from earlier in the cavity. And that is the implication you cannot put back down once you have picked it up. The two things were connected. Whatever held those shapes up, whatever they were anchored to, ran through the ceiling itself. The door was not the entrance to a hollow. It was the entrance to this. The crawler pressed on beneath the embedded lines. The air grew heavier. Condensation gathered on the lens, droplets forming and merging into larger smears that shifted every time the unit moved. The image degraded, and Orla was forced to read motion and shape instead of detail. But he kept going. 10 from the entry point, 15. The signal held mostly with brief flickers of interference rippling through the feed before it steadied again. Nothing sustained, nothing that forced a stop, but enough to notice, enough to remember. And then something happened fast enough that it almost slipped past, unrecorded. The flare, a flare of light brighter than the crawler's own lamps, though not by much. It appeared ahead, just past the edge of the field of view. A sudden bloom that bounced off the moisture hanging in the air and washed across the lens, and then it was gone. No source, no lingering glow. Nothing left behind to explain it. Orla stopped the crawler, held position, waited. Nothing happened. The space ahead stayed dark and unchanged, indifferent, as though it had never flared at all. So he scrubbed back through the feed, isolating the frames where the flare appeared. And there it was, consistent across multiple frames. Not a glitch in the camera, not a reflection bouncing off the crawler itself. Something external, something that had been inside that sealed space with his machine producing its own light. Think about what that requires. Light needs energy. Energy needs a source. And there was no source down there that anyone could account for in a chamber that had been closed off from the world for longer than anyone can measure. He watched the isolated frames over and over, looking for the angle that would turn it back into a reflection. A stray glint off the crawler's own housing, anything he could file away and forget. The frames refused him. Whatever had made that light had done it on its own in the dark with no one and nothing to switch it on. He started the crawler forward again, slow toward the spot where the light had been, and the ground got worse. The tracks began to struggle, not failing outright, but working visibly harder for every inch. The surface under that thin liquid layer gave a little under the weight, bleeding away traction. The pooling deepened only slightly, but enough that the crawler dipped in places. One track losing grip for a moment before catching again. The signal degraded too, more noticeably now. Static crawled across the feed. The image distorted, recovered, distorted again. The further in it went, the less stable everything around it became, as if the chamber itself did not want the machine going any deeper. And here is the detail Orla could not shake afterward. The flare had come from somewhere ahead. He was now driving his only camera straight toward whatever had made it. He had no idea what was producing light in a sealed chamber that had been dark since before there were people to wonder about it. He just knew that it had, and that it might do it again closer this time. Where it stopped. He pushed the crawler to roughly 20 in. That is where it stopped, and it did not stop because he chose to stop it. It lost traction completely. The ground simply stopped supporting consistent movement. The track spun, displacing the soft surface layer without carrying the unit any further forward. And at the very same moment, the interference climbed to the point where losing the feed entirely became a real and immediate risk. 20 deep in a space he had no map of. With no second way in, the picture flickering toward black, he held position. He tried small adjustments. Nothing improved. So he made the call and he started bringing the crawler back. He told himself the decision was purely practical. The unit was stuck. The signal was failing. Pushing further risked losing the machine entirely. And with it, every frame it had recorded. All of that was true. But there is a difference between a machine that cannot go forward and an operator who has stopped wanting it to. And Orla has never been completely clear about which one applied in those last few minutes. He had come to that cliff to prove the space was empty. By the time the tracks gave out, out, he was no longer trying to prove anything at all. He was trying to leave. The crawler retraced its path. The suspended moisture kept smearing the image the whole way back, but the structure stayed visible as the unit retreated. The embedded ceiling lines passing overhead again. The dark, soft floor giving way to firmer ground. And then the suspended forms came back into frame, hanging there unchanged, except again, not completely unchanged. The same subtle inconsistencies, the same shifts too small to be certain of, as if their position had never been entirely fixed in the first place and never would be. The crawler passed beneath them and kept going until the narrow opening reappeared. Faint outside light bleeding into the edge of the frame, and then it was back in open air, sitting on broken rock under an ordinary Irish sky. But the thing it had filmed was still in there, and the door was still out there. What he sealed, he did not send the crawler back in. He did not attempt a second pass. He pulled his equipment and he sealed the opening. Not permanently, but cleanly. Cleanly enough that from the outside, there was no visible sign anything had been done to the rock at all. No fracture lines, no leftover debris, no trace of a drill. The cliff face looked exactly as untouched as the day he had arrived. He sealed it the way you close a door you are no longer sure you should ever have opened. And the stone door, the thing that started all of this, has not been recorded opening again since. No further movement, no new footage, nothing. People still walk that coastline every single day. They photograph the columns. They trace the old story of Finn McCool across the rock with their fingers, and not one of them knows they are standing a few feet from a wall that Orla put a camera through. The door keeps its silence. It has had a lot of practice, but sit with the weight of this for a second. The cavity he reached runs parallel to that section of cliff. What he found sits alongside the structure people swore they watched move, which means whatever is behind that stone door is not empty. It is not a hollow. It is not a natural void carved out by ordinary geology over millions of slow years. It is structured. It is deliberate, and it had been concealed inside solid volcanic rock the entire time with one moving door as the only way in or out. There is no official record of any of this, no documentation, no published findings, no institution anywhere acknowledging that the space exists. There is only a single account from a man who mapped the rock with his own hands, drilled through a thinner section of it, and sent a camera into whatever was waiting on the other side. He was careful about how he described what came back. Measured, precise. He hedged on everything he could not be sure of. The distances, the shapes, the light. But there was one thing he never hedged on. Not once. He never called it natural. And here is the part that should keep you up tonight. The footage cannot show everything. Physically cannot. The lens distorts, the moisture interferes, depth compresses, and the light in that place behaves in ways it is not supposed to. What ends up in the recording actually looks clearer than what Orla says he watched in real time. Everyone who has seen it walks away with the same reaction he did, the same one you are sitting with right now. Even with all that uncertainty stacked up, the conclusion never wavered. There was something in there, and it was not supposed to be. If what he reached is only one part of something larger, if that flooded corridor with the beams in its ceiling is just a single passage running alongside something far bigger, then whatever sits behind that stone door still has not been fully seen by anyone alive. So if that door opens again, if whatever mechanism let it move the first time decides to repeat itself, the real question is not what will finally be revealed when it does. The real question is what has already been waiting on the other side this entire time. If you made it all the way here, I want to hear it from you. Do you think Kieran Orla drilled into something built, something deliberate, something placed there on purpose? Or is there an explanation the geology can still account for? One that the rest of us are missing? Drop it in the comments because I read them. And the best theories on this channel almost always come from you. And if this one got under your skin even a little, subscribe and stay close. The next door is always nearer than it looks.